Greetings, everyone. We're here with Dr. Paul Fleischman. He is a, are you a retired psychiatrist now,
Yes,
Paul?
Yeah. Retired, yes.
Okay, retired psychiatrist and longtime Vipassana practitioner in the tradition of Essen Goenka. He's been an assistant teacher within that tradition. And so today he's going to be talking about a book he wrote a while back, talking about how the Buddha taught nonviolence, not pacifism. So thank you very much for doing this, Paul. We really appreciate it.
I've been asked to give this talk by Lords, who asked me to join the meeting that's coming up on the 15th of August, but some health issues are in my family and I can't be there on the 15th. So I'll talk to you now with some of the questions Lords asked me to address, specifically the difference between nonviolence and pacifism, the Buddha's take on that, and how the Buddha's take on that may inform some of our thinking, feeling, and actions in the contemporary world. So the topic is the Buddha taught nonviolence, not pacifism. When I refer to the Buddha, I'll be talking only about the Buddha as he is described in the Pāli canon. Of course, there are later texts from other traditions in Asia in which the Buddha may speak. But historically speaking, we tend to feel that something close to the historical Buddha is more likely to be found in the Pāli canon, the older texts from India, from about 500 BC. I'll be referring to the Pāli canon in general. There are some specific discourses in which the Buddha has conversations with a king. Let's remember that the Buddha was of the same caste as kings. So it's a caste-in-caste conversation. An aging king, who is the age of the Buddha, when this discourse takes place, the Buddha was allegedly 80. This king was allegedly 80. In the same age, they were old friends. And the king said, I feel that now that I'm 80, death is rolling in upon me. What an image. And the king is asking the Buddha, what should I do now that I feel my life path is short? And I, the king, have spent my life as an anointed, noble king, doing the right thing, that is, being filled with greed and the love of power, and protecting my country by expanding its boundaries and fighting wars. The Buddha never criticizes those comments. He doesn't say to the king, you shouldn't be expanding your territories and fighting wars. The king elaborates in great details. I wrote down the different kinds of wars the king fought. He fought battles with elephants, battles with cavalry, battles with chariot, battles with infantry, bribing, buying off other opposing warriors, and using his ministers to divide the enemy and conquer them. The Buddha never criticizes that. Instead, the Buddha's reply is, if you feel death is rolling in on you, you should practice the Dhamma in its fullness. You should stop doing harmful deeds and do good deeds so that when you face death, your karmic suitcase is filled with good deeds. That's the whole reply. And this king allegedly adopts that attitude. The interesting thing is there's nowhere in the Buddha's teaching, contrary to very common modern belief, where the Buddha ever takes a stance against war. There was also slavery in ancient India in the Pāli canon. The Buddha never takes a stance against slavery. The Buddha never said that some kings should actually be queens and there should be female rulers. The Buddha is being falsely reconstructed as a modern progressive, as if the Buddha were voting for Bernie Sanders. That's not true, and that's not what the Pāli canon says. Instead, the Buddha taught the Dhamma and limited his teaching to the Dhamma. And the Dhamma is a psychological, spiritual, individual pathway that leads a person to the purification of their heart and mind, so they're less filled with the things the king said he was filled with, greed, lust for power, and so that the practitioner becomes more filled with metta, karuna, that is, loving kindness, compassion, and other parmis or virtues. So the Buddha limited his teaching to those specific features. When we use the word pacifism, we're talking about a social, political, philosophical action pathway that was designed in Europe in the recent hundreds of years, based upon teachings that allegedly were derived from the New Testament, but that heavily came from remodeling the New Testament from thinkers like Tolstoy and, of course, the many other Protestant nonviolent churches like the Quakers, the Shakers, and other German and Swiss sects in the 1600s and later who developed pacifism. So pacifism was never mentioned by the Buddha. He never conceived of an organized social political philosophy of any kind. And he was a conservative. He upheld the social conditions around him, felt he was in the same inner club as kings, and didn't trouble or upset society. Instead, what he did was create an alternative society where people could step out of normal society, join the Sangha, which then was radically opposed to slavery, preventing women from meditating. The Sangha was opposed to preventing women. That is, it included women. There was some conflict around that, but we know very well that women became bhikkhunis, practiced Dhamma, became enlightened. That's all in the Pāli Canon. And the Buddha also was for nonviolence. So he wasn't for pacifism, social political activity. He was for nonviolence, the individual stance against harm. And nonviolence is one of the keys, or maybe the key, to the teaching of the Buddha, that all your, not only your actions, but your thoughts and your feeling states should also aim towards nonviolence. So the teaching is heavily geared to the cultivation of mental states by an individual who can then affiliate with other individuals who cultivate that mental state. That would be the Sangha. But it is not a teaching about social and political philosophy as might have arisen in Europe in the 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, nor as what might have occurred in the United States. Now, another feature of the Buddha's teaching that is sometimes blurred by modern people who wish to find in the Buddha an exact model replica for how they themselves should live their life. So another way that that distortion enters in is the question of moral ambiguity. In the Dhamma, it says, don't harm others, help others. But in life, it's hard to know sometimes when you're harming and when you're helping. Let's take a few examples from human history where this becomes very blurred. Abraham Lincoln tends to be looked upon as a very helpful person. Undoubtedly, slavery would not have ended when it did without Lincoln. There are many ambiguities and complexities to that. He was not the total force behind anti-slavery, but he was the implementer of the war. And he took the very, very strong and difficult position of persevering in the war to end slavery. And ending slavery was Lincoln's very particular cause, even though he has made statements like preserving the Union was his cause. Those were political statements. His psychological impetus was to end slavery. So Lincoln's worst enemies were pacifists. Pacifists who existed in the United States in the middle of the 19th century because we had pacifist religious people like Quakers, Shakers, Mennonites, Amish. They were already present and forceful in American society, and they were opposed to warfare. And there were also pacifists who were not religious, but who were political social pacifists. And they were a problem for Lincoln since they wouldn't participate in helping run the war effort. In fact, they undermined the war effort. That's an example where pacifism and not doing harm are ambiguously related. In the mind of the pacifist, no doubt, not joining the war guarantees he will not do harm, he will not kill or hurt anybody, but also guarantees that slavery will continue. We have many other examples of moral complexity in our modern world. Another example would be World War II. There were some Americans, not many, mostly of traditional peace churches, once again, Mennonite, Mennonite, Quaker, etc., who were conscientious objectors in World War II. I have had friends, these people are now all deceased. People have to be a good 20, 25, or 30 years older than I am to have been in the war, Second World War, or conscientious objectors. So almost all of them are dead. But I had good friends who were conscientious objectors in World War II, and I also had friends who were combatants in the American military in World War II. Well, who was doing harm and who was doing help? The soldiers may have felt they were not doing harm because they were fighting a war to terminate the death factories. And the pacifists may have felt they were not doing harm because they were definitely not killing anybody. I don't know which is right, and I can't use a little 15-minute talk to make any implications as to which is right. Instead, I want to say the Dhamma practitioner, the ordinary human being, faces problems of moral ambiguity that the Buddha's description of Dhamma 2,500 years ago couldn't possibly have taken into account. Therefore, to rigidly adhere to one view and to claim that it derives from Buddha is inaccurate. We don't know what the Buddha would have said to a conscientious objector in World War II or to a pacifist during the Civil War. And all of our lives filled with news, filled with information, filled with having read many books. Let's remember that Buddha probably never read a book. It was almost all verbal, oral teaching. It was quite limited. You couldn't go to a library, couldn't get a PhD and read 100 books. It didn't exist. So the complexity with which we see the probability of outcomes and the morality of outcomes that are probable is very different than are described in the simple examples of the Pāli Canon, which say, do a kind deed, don't do a harmful deed. Therefore, our position as either Dhamma practitioners or as just moral citizens of the modern world is more lonely, is more difficult, is more complicated. I think that the position of Dhamma should teach us to develop a deep, sustained, introspective, self-questioning, self-enlightening practice that leads us to gain the intellectual, psychological, emotional, and moral complexity with which we can solve for ourselves these moral dilemmas that the world seems to put on our plate every day now. That's very different than having a particular moralistic teaching, such as is found in the Jataka tales. Do this one right thing, don't do this one wrong thing. That's why it's important to me that we keep in mind that the Buddha taught nonviolence, not pacifism. It could be that there's a Dhamma practitioner, deeply sincere, deeply self-reflective, well-balanced in meditation, who might choose pacifism, or who might not choose pacifism, or who might choose pacifism when he or she is 24 and not choose it when he or she is 48, or who might choose it in this particular circumstance and not in another circumstance, regardless of the age at which one is confronting these issues. So the Buddha's teaching, properly interpreted, I think, provides us enormous commitment to nonviolence, the heart and soul of the Dhamma, and yet flexibility in application of that action into the many scenarios that our contemporary lives thrusts us into. There's a few great quotes. Bernard Shaw said, "Every important idea began as a heresy." Shimon Peres at the Nobel Peace Prize said, "If you're two people together, you're much more than two. But if you're one person alone, you're much less than one." So another part of our discernment that comes through the Dhamma traditions is the tradition of the Sangha, affiliation with others who share our mental state, who are developing as we are developing, and who can help us put our thoughts, feelings, attitudes, beliefs, and Dhamma insights into more effective action. Let's remember that the Buddha was very, very concerned with action. It was not only about mental states. So that if we could say the Buddha had two agendas that were linked. One is purifying our hearts and minds, developing metta, karuna, and allied harmonies, and letting go of aggression, pride, ego, passion, etc. But the other was implementing it in the world. A person who isn't acting in the world is not fulfilling their parmis, is not practicing metta, is not practicing karuna, and therefore is not on the path of Dhamma. These two agendas should be easy to synthesize. When we develop our mental states, we want to act upon them, and that's beautiful and should be easy. But as I've been saying, sometimes it becomes quite complicated. We develop a mental state, let's say, of wishing to express our metta, and we confront a moral ambiguity where it's not clear whether metta would consist of aggressive strength in physical action, of restraining, of violent opposition, or whether metta would consist of never using aggressive strength against anybody, even a violent bully. So the Buddha has placed us in a position to grow doubly, but has also left us with a set of discernments that is up to us and constitute our karma. That's why the Buddha did not say to the king, "Why don't you quit being a king?" Or "Why don't you kick the ass of the other side?" Or "Why don't you give up your army?" Or "Why don't you use trickery but not military advice, military stances?" Or "Why not use the military and not use trickery?" No advice of that kind was ever given by the Buddha, including no statement about pacifism. Instead, the statement is, your fate rests upon your ability to live the Dhamma life, that is, to purify your heart and mind and keep it that way under as many circumstances as possible. It's up to you. So I think that would be the main message I would want to give back to Lords, and thanking her for asking me to present this talk. And there is a book available at Pariyatti called The Buddha Taught Nonviolence, Not Pacifism. It says the same things I just said.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Paul Fleischman, a practitioner within the S.N. Goenka tradition.
Thank you, John.